I've been working on a custom desk for live streaming here at the shop, and during the build, I realized I've added some new tools to the shop that have already changed my woodworking workflow in the short time I've owned them, and I figured I could talk about some of them in this video. And some of these tools are definitely pretty pricey, but I think for someone like me who makes stuff for a living, they'll definitely be worthwhile in the long run. The first tool I've been using a lot lately are these panel clamps, and these are from Rockler. Gluing up individual boards into larger panels is one of the most quintessential tasks for any woodworker, and there are very few projects where I don't have at least one panel glue up. And historically, I've always used something like biscuits or dowels or dominoes to help keep the boards aligned during the glue up, and while this works really well, it also adds a decent amount of time to the build process. You have to lay out the locations of all your joints and cut all of those alignment slots, all of which requires a lot of lumber handling. Also, on certain projects where the panel will be cut down into different shapes or sizes, like round tabletops or this desk I'm working on, those biscuits or dominoes can end up being exposed in the finished project unless you painstakingly lay out their locations. And there's nothing more frustrating than seeing a domino peeking out of the edge of your freshly cut tabletop, and this has happened to me more times than I'd like to admit. For those reasons, I think these panel clamps are a great option for anyone who does a lot of these styles of glue-ups. And these clamps come in two different sizes, and the mini versions are perfect for making cutting boards, since making those requires gluing together tons of smaller strips of wood. And while these clamps certainly aren't cheap, you don't really need a ton of them even for larger panels like this desk. As long as your boards are milled flat and square, having one of these panel clamps every few feet is enough to keep your boards aligned, and then you can just fill in the other areas with more standard clamps like these parallel clamps. Also, these panel clamps really make the glue up a lot less stressful, since you aren't having to juggle adding your alignment pieces during the process and then trying to get those all aligned and seated while glue is dripping everywhere. And if these panel clamps are out of your budget, you can definitely DIY similar options or just use something like clamping cauls to help keep your panel glue ups flat. The next tool on my list is actually a tool I had at my last shop, but didn't really get to use much since I was in the middle of the tiny house build and the shop renovation, and that's the Lamello Zeta P2. And you might be looking at this and thinking it looks a lot like a fancy biscuit joiner, and you'd be spot on. Lamello literally invented biscuit joinery, and their top 21 biscuit joiner is kind of the Rolls Royce in this category. And if you've watched any of my buddy Mike Farrington's videos, his mighty biscuit jointer is a Lamello top 21. And these definitely aren't the biscuit joiners you see at your local big box store. These are made for production shops with much higher accuracy and a pretty eye-watering price tag. So this Zeta P2, in addition to being able to cut standard biscuit slots, also has another trick up its sleeve. As you might be able to tell during the plunge process, when the P2 gets to full depth, it hits a little button that allows the blade to oscillate up and down, which creates a recessed area in that standard biscuit slot. And this recessed area is really what sets the P2 apart, and I think this is going to open up a ton of different joinery options for me. There are a huge range of connectors that work with the slots cut by the Zeta, and you might have seen these in use in some other woodworking videos like my buddy Keith Johnson's, for example. On this particular desk project, I had a few different spots where these connectors would come in handy, the first of which was gluing together the two angled sections that made up each half of the desk. And I definitely could have figured out some kind of awkward clamping setup to make this work, but instead I could just use the Zeta to cut a few slots for these Clamex connectors. And these connectors are typically used for knockdown joinery, since this little mechanism can be tightened and loosened after assembly, but I figured they'd also work great here since they provide even more clamping force than the standard Tenso connectors. I used a combination of dominoes, which gave the joint more strength, and the Clamex connectors, and as you can see, the joint was pulled together perfectly with zero clamping. Really cool. Since this desk is such a big and awkward shape, I wanted it to be able to be disassembled into two halves, so I repeated the process to cut more domino mortises and biscuit slots, and this, combined with the metal leg, which will span the two halves, should make for a super strong desk. And now you can probably tell why I wanted to be able to at least partially disassemble this absolute unit of a desktop.
Let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Element. So in case you haven't heard of it, Element is a super tasty drink mix with everything you need and nothing you don't. Element contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium, with no sugar, no artificial ingredients, and no BS. Basically everything you need to stay hydrated and nothing you don't. So I've personally been drinking Element multiple times a week for years now, and it makes me feel great anytime I'm working up a sweat, whether that's mountain biking, working in the yard, or just working here in the shop. Basically, if I know I'm going to be sweating a lot, I'm bringing Element. So right now, Element is offering you guys one of these sample packs, including 8 packs of Element, free with any order, and this is a great way to try 8 different flavors of Element. My favorite has got to be watermelon salt, but they are honestly all delicious. So to get your free sample pack, go to drinklmnt.com/crafted. And this deal is only available through my link, so make sure to click the link in the video description below and grab some Element for yourself. Thanks again to Element for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work.
I refined the shape of the desktop by cutting a radius on the sharp corners, and I also recessed the mounting plate for the metal legs into the bottom of the desktop, adding some threaded inserts so I could easily install and remove the legs. Next, it was time to add a super heavy roundover to the edges of the desktop, and this is where new tool number 3 came into play. So as you guys probably know, I'm a big fan of heavy edge profiles, including big chamfers and roundovers, but my main router, the Festool OF1400, has felt a little underpowered for these jobs recently. I absolutely love this router, but I've really struggled with it on some of these bigger operations. For example, when I went to add the chamfer to the live edge table I built for my in-laws, I had to really force the bit through the material and make way more passes than I wanted to get the job done. So after looking around at different options and watching way too many YouTube videos on the topic, I decided to add my router's big brother, the OF2200, to my tool arsenal. And to be completely honest, I was a little scared to fire this thing up for the first time, but thankfully the setup process was similar to my other Festool routers. And if you've never used a Festool router, they've got some really handy features that set them apart. My favorite of which is probably this ratcheting collet, which makes installing and removing bits so simple. The OF2200 also features this interchangeable baseplate system, which should make swapping between different baseplates way easier than on my other router and should open up a lot more routing options. Anyway, after getting the bit depth set, I could try the router for the first time, and as you can see, I was pretty blown away.
Wow. That just holy moly. That's actually amazing. Dude. Heck yes. Wow.
So this beast of a router not only chewed through the sapele and soft maple, it also left an incredible surface finish and collected almost all of the sawdust during the process. The next tool on my list, and one you've seen me using throughout the video, is my lift top assembly table. And this was another addition to my new shop space, and it has been so much handier than I expected. Now, these things are extremely pricey new, and I luckily got mine as part of an ad deal, but used versions pop up all the time on machinery auction sites. And I'm actually bidding on another lift top table as we speak, since I'd really like to add another one to my shop. And I was inspired to add this hydraulic lift table to my setup after seeing both Mike Farrington and Ishitani Furniture, another one of my favorite YouTube woodworkers, use them as the basis for their main work surfaces. I built a torsion box top complete with drawers and a bunch of T-track for the lift table, and I did an entire video on that process, and I have plans for that project if you'd like to check it out. And since building it, this assembly table has become my main workbench in the shop, and I'm continually amazed by just how handy it is to be able to raise and lower the working height of my workbench. If I'm working on tall cabinets or other big projects, I can drop the table all the way down. And if I'm working on smaller projects, I can raise the table to a more comfortable working height. The table has become even more useful since adding a chain hoist to my shop, and this has allowed me to safely and securely move the heavy projects I build by myself without messing up my back more than it already is. I also recently added a floor outlet for the lift table, and this was super easy since I built this wooden platform in my workbench area of the shop. And I don't think I'll ever go back to a shop with all concrete floors. It's really amazing how much of a difference the springiness of this wooden floor makes on how my body feels after a day of standing at my workbench. Anyway, even if you don't add an electric lift table to your setup, you could just as easily build a top for something like this comparatively inexpensive Harbor Freight hydraulic cart and get a lot of the same benefits. The next tool on the list is also the cheapest, and it's something that's made my finishing process much easier, and that's this electric buffer. So I've been using a lot of hard wax oil style finishes on my projects lately, and I've been kind of testing different versions of these finishes so I can put out a video about which ones I prefer. And while I love the way these finishes look and how they really highlight the natural beauty of the wood without giving it a plasticky appearance, the application process can be quite the workout. So if you've never used these types of finishes, you basically wipe on the finish, or you can use a plastic spreader to make the finish go a little further. But the catch is you need to come back and kind of buff off the excess finish before it's really had a chance to set up. And the timing on this can be a little tricky for larger pieces like these, especially when you're working by yourself. And that's where this buffer comes in. By using the buffer, you can really work the finish into the surface of the wood while also removing a lot of the excess all at the same time, all without working up a huge sweat. That said, the first time I used this buffer, I made the mistake of assuming it would remove all of the excess finish, but I think you definitely still need to come back with a clean rag to give the surface a further wipe down just to get every last little bit. And if you leave too much finish left on the surface with these hard wax oil finishes, they'll not only take forever to cure, they also won't leave you with as even of a sheen. This particular buffer was only around $60, and I love the fact that it's cordless since it eliminates the possibility of a dirty cord dragging across my freshly finished project. And Cam from Blacktail Studio uses a much fancier version on his projects, and I'd love to try it, but it's a little hard to justify since it costs 10 times as much as one of these buffers. A woodworking shop is always evolving because, at least to me, there's an endless number of ways to improve your techniques, workflow, and your finished product. And I realize that a lot of these tools are probably out of reach for most of you, but my hope is that if you evolve into building for a living, like I have, seeing my evolution might help you along your journey. I started my woodworking career on the floor of my garage with a miter saw and a drill, and I think by constantly looking at how I can improve, I've managed to set up a shop space I really love, and it's a place where I can build just about anything. And that's really my goal with this channel, to hopefully inspire and teach you all to get out there, get dusty, and build something you're proud of. My next video will be on a simple but sturdy DIY workbench where I use nothing but basic job site tools, so stay tuned for that if you're not as into these super fancy woodworking videos. But until then, thanks for watching, thanks for all the support, and until next week, happy building.